And welcome back to Diplomacy Now. I'm Parker sitting alongside Sebastian. And right now we are very, very happy to introduce our guest, David Firestein, who is the Vice President of the East-West Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank that focuses on finding solutions for international conflict. Firestein oversees its China, East Asia, and United States program and Russia-United States program, as well as the Institute's work on U.S.-Iran trust building. As a U.S. diplomat from 1992 to 2010, David served in U.S. embassies in Beijing for over 5 years and Moscow for over 4. From 2007 to 2009, Firestein was also an elected at-large member of the Board of Governors at the American Foreign Service Association, the Foreign Services Union and Professional Association. David Firestein speaks near native-level Chinese and fluent Russian, and is the author and co-author of 3 books on China, including 2 China-published bestsellers, Pacific Reflections, Essays on Chinese and American Society and Culture, and Here and There, 81 Conversations about China and America. In 1997, the Beijing Youth Daily described David Firestein as arguably the most influential American in China with respect to how the Chinese view the United States. And we also want to thank Tenyao Michelle for bringing David in today, and we're very happy to have him here with us. So if you would like to take it away, we'd love to hear about it.
Sure. Welcome. Welcome here, David.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here at WRGW. I'm really privileged to have this opportunity. Thank you.
So let's go into the discussion. So as you know, in Diplomacy Now, we talk a lot about foreign policy decisions national leaders make every day. So with the coming up of the 2016 U.S. presidential election, what role do you see foreign policy issues play in this campaign? And do you think it has a significant role in this campaign, and how will it compare to past campaigns?
Well, it's a great question. Obviously now there's a lot of attention, increasing level of attention on the 2016 campaign, although it's only early 2015 at this point, but this is really the sweet spot for when major prospective candidates start to explore candidacies and announce candidacies. So we're really getting into it, and I think this question of the role of foreign policy and diplomacy as an issue in the presidential campaign is very timely, and it's a really interesting topic. Historically, the conventional wisdom has been that foreign policy tends to play a fairly minor and unimportant role in presidential campaigns. That basically what really is at issue for the average American voter is sort of issues that hit closer to home in terms of the economy, in terms of jobs, education, and things that really affect average people on a day-to-day basis. I sense that 2016 is going to be a little different than past elections with respect to this issue, because if you and there are 2 reasons for that. If you look around the world, I think it would be hard to find a time in recent history outside of a world war type scenario going back some decades where there has been such a tumultuous period in the world around sort of major areas of the world at a time of otherwise sort of general peace. So, for example, you've got very serious issues pertaining to Russia and Ukraine that are in the headlines every day. And, of course, Russia, for all the wrong reasons, is in the headlines again, even yesterday and today because of the death, the murder of an opposition leader there. You've got Iran and the ongoing nuclear discussions. You've got North Korea. You've got, obviously, the Islamic State, the questions of Iraq in Syria, which are interrelated, and as well as a number of other issues. So there are kind of a huge or disproportionate number of really high-profile foreign policy issues that are so dramatic in some ways that they're actually capturing the attention, I think, of the average American voter to a degree that is maybe above the norm relative to past elections. So that's one reason why I think that 2016 is going to be a little different than past elections. But the other is, if you look at the prospective candidates and kind of get a sense for who they are, who they're likely to be, one thing that's really interesting about 2016 is that for the first time in my memory, and I think for the first time in the modern era of presidential campaigns, let's say at least since World War II, if not going back even further, we're going to have a former Secretary of State running for president as one of the 2 major candidates, obviously Hillary Clinton. who I believe and most people believe will run and will win the nomination and be a very formidable candidate. So, when you have a former Secretary of State running for president, I think it's logical to assume that foreign policy issues will probably play a more outsized role in the campaign than would be the case if, for example, you had two governors running against each other. So for those reasons, I actually think that foreign policy is going to be significant. There's some huge issues out there that average people, the issues are so big that sort of average voters can't avoid them, and it's captivating the attention of the American electorate. And one of the candidates is someone who's done diplomacy for 4 years at the highest level. And for those reasons, I think we're going to see an unusual emphasis on foreign policy, at least relative to years past.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think foreign policy issues are something that the president, especially the president of the United States, can't avoid in their everyday in the office. So I think it's really important for voters to vote for a candidate that has enough experience in foreign policy areas. So follow up with this question, what do you see, who do you see as the front-running figures at this point in the process, and how would you characterize their relative level of experience in foreign policy area?
Well, I think on the Democratic side, it's very easy. I think it's very clear that Hillary Clinton is the front-running candidate. She's not technically a candidate. She hasn't declared. Even an exploratory committee, but the fact is it's very clear that she's running. She will run. She will go through all the various steps that are associated with that, and she'll be, in my judgment, and the judgment of probably most Americans that follow politics, the nominee of the Democratic Party. On the other side of the ledger, it's a very different picture. Because actually the Republican primaries, if you will, the Republican nomination process is very open at this point. There are a number of names that are in the mix. In fact, I think by some counts there are about 24 different prominent Republicans that are, at least theoretically or on paper, credible candidates for president to one degree or another, who have expressed interest or are very interested or who have flirted with it or hinted at it and so forth and so on. But within that group, even if you look at sort of the top tier or the top two tiers of candidates, of sort of the top 5 or 6 names that one might talk about, people like Jeb Bush, former governor of Florida, Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Senator Paul, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, and then there are other names, Governor Scott Walker, Governor Jindal of Louisiana, and so on. Those are kind of the names that are out there right now. And if you look at that list of folks, a couple of points I think can be made. Number one is most of them are governors, not senators. And so most of them don't have any federal service experience in the civil, at least in a civil sense, even for those who may have served in the military. So most of them have not really had to deal with foreign affairs in a serious and sustained way. At most, as governor, they've perhaps been involved in trade promotion, economic development for their state, trying to increase their state's exports to other parts of the world and so on. But that's a very small subset of foreign affairs generally. It's important, but it's really not comparable to issues like the Iranian nuclear negotiations, Russia, Ukraine, Crimea, China, maritime disputes, North Korea, and the whole list of other issues, Islamic State and so on. So, the fact is, if you're talking about governors, which is probably the majority of top-tier candidates on the Republican side, these are folks that by definition don't have a lot of foreign policy experience, and particularly when you compare them to the presumptive Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, there's an enormous gap there. Now, there are a couple of senators in the mix, as I mentioned, and probably the leading senator on the Republican side, seemingly at this time, is Marco Rubio of Florida. I think he has somewhat more foreign policy experience and somewhat higher level of credentialing because at least he's been in the Senate for a couple of years or a number of years and is on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he's dealt with foreign policy issues in a serious way. In that regard, he's probably the single most credentialed sort of top 1 or 2 tier GOP candidate for president in terms of foreign policy. And then, of course, there's Jeb Bush, who the former governor of Florida, again, a former governor, not someone who's really dealt in depth on foreign policy issues, but someone who I think is going to be making an effort to kind of bone up on foreign policy as we go forward. But the basic point I would make is, if you look at the likely scenario of Hillary Clinton emerging as the Democratic nominee, and one of the types of folks that I've mentioned, in perhaps even names that I haven't mentioned, but in that category, there's no one that has very substantial credentials on foreign policy relative to their Democratic opponent. So I think this will be an area where there is a pretty sharp gap that'll be visible to the American people in the course of the campaign.
Thank you. So, as you mentioned, Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, gave his first foreign policy speech at the Chicago World Affairs Council last Wednesday. And in his speech, he touched on various issues like Israel and Iran, reset on Cuba, counterterrorism, relationship with the allies, and the 6 principles he thinks that will help America regain its global leadership, and so on. So with this speech covered like many issues, so I was wondering, what do you make of his speech?
Well, first of all, the speech got a lot of attention, as well it should. The governor, former Governor Bush himself, noted at the outset that he was surprised at how many people came to listen. But obviously he is probably the front-running candidate on the Republican side right now. And this really was his first speech, as far as I can tell, as a presumptive presidential candidate. That's kind of a national level speech. And it's certainly his first speech as a presumptive candidate on the topic of foreign policy. So it did get a lot of attention. I have a couple of observations about it. One is, it was kind of the tone-setting or scene-setting speech that you would expect from someone who has not been deeply immersed in foreign policy, but who realizes he's going to need to kind of carve out a foreign policy identity or set of positions as part of his presumptive campaign for president. He has not officially declared, but he's created an exploratory committee, and obviously I think will certainly declare soon. So he realizes that, having been governor, he's got a record on domestic policy, whether it's with respect to education, whether it's with respect to taxes, to the environment, to various other issues, economic development. But with respect to foreign policy, he knows that he needs to stake out some positions, and that's what he's trying to do. One of the things that I think was clear, if you looked at the speech and also the questions and answers that occurred afterwards, was that both the speech itself and his responses to some of the questions made it clear that he doesn't have a lot of depth on foreign policy at this time, and I think he himself has acknowledged that. In fact, he acknowledged it in the context of at least one of the responses to the questions that was asked, where he said, "Look, I don't have all the details. I haven't been following this, in great detail. But from what I understand, I think that it's A, B, C, or D." And that's an honest answer. It's a fair answer, but it's not the kind of answer that I think American voters are looking for from someone who would presume to be a leading candidate for president, or at least a leading nominee within his party to gain the nomination. So, I think that's the kind of thing that he's going to have to sharpen as he goes forward to give people a greater sense of confidence that he is now, in his capacity as a presumptive candidate, someone who's paying attention to these issues. He also laid out a kind of framework of 6 principles, which I think you mentioned. Things like getting America's economic house in order, standing by our allies, standing by principles. What I would say about that is it was okay. No major gaffes or anything like that. But at the same time, it's not something that's particularly memorable yet, at least relative to the kind of speeches that are often given by people in his position. So I think he's in the process of finding his voice and his identity on issues of foreign policy. And the Chicago speech was a significant first step. And although there have been mixed reviews, and some sort of see it as very positive, and others, including a columnist in the Washington Post, Dana Milbank, thought it was kind of full of gaffes, flaws, and problems, I think the reality is it was a fair start for him, but it also makes it clear that he's going to have to do, and will do, a lot of additional work to get up to speed on an enormously complex set of issues. that is a lot harder when you look at them up close than it is when you're kind of taking pot shots from the back row. And now that he's a serious candidate de facto for president, he's going to have to start sinking his teeth into these issues in a way that he hasn't had to up to now. And so I think I suspect he'll be getting some good feedback on the basis of the speech and sharpening his message as he goes forward.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with you. And as I observed in his speech that, and also from the trend of the past presidential campaigns, it's very common for presidential candidates to criticize the incumbent administration in their campaigns, and Bush is no exception. So right in the beginning of his speech, he pointed out that the Obama administration is indecisive and inconsistent, and like he criticized that Obama administration left America less influential in the world, and like his retreat from Iraq actually gave rise to a regional terrorist groups. So to what extent will this next presidential election be a kind of referendum on President Obama's foreign policy decisions, and what is your take on the contours of the likely Republican critique?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think a couple of different things in response. Number one, I think the election to a very significant degree will be a referendum on Obama in a general sense, as is often the case when you have a two-term president leaving. For example, George W. Bush a few years ago, and before that, Bill Clinton. So you had folks that had served 2 terms. The nation well understood what those presidents stood for and what they did, and had opinions about it, and to some degree that's always going to seep into that next election. So that's a general point. I think that partly for reasons that I mentioned at the outset, foreign policy is going to figure more prominently in this presidential campaign than it perhaps has in the past, at least in the last couple of decades. And I think that the fact is Obama has come under a lot of criticism, particularly from the Republican side, sometimes even from within the ranks of Democrats, for some of his foreign policy decisions and some of the foreign policy results that have occurred on, if you will, on his watch. So you mentioned the words that Governor Bush used in his speech, indecisive, inconsistent. These are the kind of themes that I think we hear coming out of Republican critiques of the president more generally. By the way, not just with respect to foreign policy, but also domestic policy. But if anything, we hear it more in reference to foreign policy because there are some very clear sort of issues and in some cases crises that people can point to kind of crystallize what they mean. A couple of examples, and I think this reflects what we will see in terms of Republican critiquing of the Obama administration's foreign policy record. And by the way, Secretary Clinton was a big Secretary of State Clinton, and now candidate Clinton was a big part of the Obama administration's foreign policy efforts because obviously she was his first Secretary of State. So all of this is highly relevant to her record as well. But take the case of Russia as an example. The Obama-Clinton foreign policy team and the administration came in. One of their major foreign policy initiatives was to, quote, reset with Russia. And in fact, in the first couple of years of the reset, it actually yielded some very positive fruit. I don't think anyone would, that's being objective, would dispute that. However, it's also indisputable that the relationship has dramatically soured since then, and in fact is probably in the worst state that it's been ever since the end of the Cold War. And I don't think anyone would dispute that either. So the fact is there's been some real problems in U.S.-Russia relations, and people will look at Obama's record and say, here's someone who came in saying, I'm going to make things better with Russia, and look where they are now. And whether that's fair or unfair, whether there's a lot of nuance that's lost, that's something that's going to resonate, I think, to some degree with the American people. Just a side note here, I think American voters generally don't pay a lot of attention to, if you will, kind of small countries, but there are a few countries that cut through the noise and touch the American mindset, the American mind, the American imagination in a way that other countries don't. Russia is one of those countries for historical reasons. China is one of those countries. Perhaps Iran is. There may be others, but Russia and China, I think in particular, are big enough and hefty enough to sort of cut through, and people, to one degree or another, kind of care about these countries because they're so big, they're so powerful, and so on. So, the Russia piece, I think, is one element. I think the president is getting a lot of criticism and will continue to get a lot of criticism in all likelihood, whether justified or not. One can make that judgment about the issue of Iran. And basically the Republican critique is he's being too soft on Iran. He's trying to negotiate with folks that are, in a sense, never going to do what we want them to do, so the critique goes. And so the idea is that there's a kind of softness to Obama's treatment of and dealing with Iran. Similarly, I think you'll see Republicans trying to apply that notion of softness and consistency and decisiveness with respect to China as well. And although the China example is probably less dramatic than the Russia case or the Iran case, nevertheless, there are tensions in the relationship. There are maritime disputes. There is a sense that China is being aggressive towards some of its East Asian neighbors. China would dispute that, but certainly there's a view in the United States that that's the case. And certainly a lot of people in the United States are really concerned about China's cyber espionage on the United States. So for those reasons, I think China is going to get drawn in. And of course, there are other issues. It goes without saying the Islamic State, the horrific and savage beheadings that we've seen, all of that is crystallizing American tension on, the Islamic State-related issues, Iraq, Syria, and so on. So I think this notion of this is not a strong leader, this is not someone who has led America well, this is not someone who has left America more secure, those are the kind of critiques that are going to be offered by the Republicans. And, again, the fact that Clinton in all likelihood will be the Democratic nominee will make this a pretty direct debate because she was Secretary of State for the majority up to now, of the Obama administration and bears a significant share of the responsibility for this administration's foreign policy. So I think it'll be a very rich debate, and that's proper and fitting, by the way, for a presidential election on these kinds of issues. And I think it'll be, for those of us who are interested in international relations, foreign policy, diplomacy, as the listeners of this show are, I think it'll be a really fascinating campaign to watch.
Okay, so let's look at the world from a bigger picture. We have multiple tensions and conflicts going on around the world. Like we have Russia, Ukraine, Middle East in the north, and Asian territorial dispute in the east, European debt crisis in the west, and we have constant civil wars that's going on in Africa. So do you have a particular view on what drives all those instabilities in international relations?
Well, it's interesting. I've actually been thinking about this issue quite a bit lately. And in fact, I'm planning to do some speaking on it later this year. I do have some thoughts on it. As I look back at others who have tried to kind of theorize or understand or explain why conflict in the world happens, we've kind of gone through cycles over the years. And there's been some big theories that have sort of seemed at first very bold and visionary, and then they seem to actually make a lot of intuitive sense and sort of, why didn't we think of this before? And then over a period of time, the theory seemed to have difficulty explaining what was actually happening in the world today, and it kind of went by the wayside. So just to put my thoughts in context, as I think about this issue, I think about some of those past explanations. So for example, Francis Fukuyama, who about 25 years ago wrote a very influential article and then book called The End of History. And it was the idea that with the end of the Cold War, and basically the U.S. and Western victory in the Cold War, that the idea that there was a real struggle in the world for, if you will, ideological correctness and for the sort of proving that you're right, that was over. We won, they lost, we were right, they were wrong. Everybody sort of came to understand that. And specifically what that meant was democracy is the best way to go forward in terms of governance, and the market or capitalism is the most efficient way to go forward in terms of economics. That was the argument. And therefore, according to that theory, there really shouldn't have been sort of major struggle or conflict or tensions in the world after that, because in a sense history had completed itself. We were at the end of the historical journey, everybody agreed. And of course what happened after that is history didn't go away and conflict didn't go away. And after some number of years, people realized that didn't seem to explain everything because, after all, there were still conflicts. And so Samuel Huntington came up with the idea of the clash of civilizations and said, well, this is a different theory. Really, what's at issue in international conflict is the rifts or the fault lines between civilizations. So you've got North America and Europe in one category, South America is its own group, Africa, Russia is in its own category, South Asia, East Asia, Confucian East Asia, and so on. And the idea was that you'd have conflict along the fault lines, the geo-civilizational fault lines. But it turns out that we see a lot of cases where the conflict is occurring within fault lines. So, for example, within Confucian East Asia, just to take the case of China and Vietnam, you have substantial tensions there over maritime disputes. Within South Asia, you have India and Pakistan constantly at loggerheads, and the list could go on. That doesn't seem to explain everything. And to cut to the chase, I think that if you look at the countries that seem to be at the center of the highest level of tension internationally, it's countries that have one thing in common. They're not necessarily, quote, the good guys or the bad guys. It cuts across that. They're not necessarily big, they're not necessarily small. The one thing that they have in common is that they're countries that tend to view themselves as exceptional. And whether they are exceptional in the minds or viewpoints of others is not even the case, not even the issue. What is at issue is that they regard themselves as exceptional. And so here, when you think about countries that regard themselves exceptional, you can kind of list out 6 or 7 or 8 of them right off the bat. The United States probably right at the top of the list. I mean, we're proud to call ourselves exceptional, so I don't think anyone disputes that we see ourselves that way. But Russia also sees itself as exceptional. Iran very much sees itself as exceptional. China sees itself as exceptional. North Korea sees itself as exceptional. Israel sees itself as exceptional. And one could go and name a number of other countries. And if you were to take a map of the world and say, here are the countries that most regard themselves as exceptional, and then take a map of where the likelihood for conflict is the highest and overlay the two maps, I think what you'd see is they're the same map. So my thesis, in short, is that there's a kind of clash of exceptionalisms that's occurring in the world today, and that we're seeing that to a greater and greater degree. It doesn't mean that there's open warfare in every case. In most cases, there's not. What it means is that there's a very high level of friction and tension, and a very real possibility, not necessarily probability, but a real possibility that these things could conflagrate into real conflict and to serious armed conflict. And it's issues like Iran, Israel, Iran, the United States. It's the whole question of Russia, Ukraine. It's the question of China dealing with Japan over the maritime issues in the East China Sea, China dealing with Vietnam and the Philippines. It's North Korea, which is kind of lives by its own rules. So this is what I'm exploring and researching, and I'll be doing a speech on this in Texas in April and talking about it in other venues later in the year. But to preview that, this is what I think is driving some of the tensions that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I think the concept of, which you just mentioned, the clash of exceptionalism, actually really make a lot of sense when you apply it to nowadays international conflicts. And with that, we're going to shift the discussion to 2 of my fellow students.
Yeah, perfect. And so love what you talked about with the exceptionalism and all that. But so I just want to kind of ask, personally, I'm just more of an economics guy. How do you see, especially, what's going on right now, if you can answer this really, with the global economic situation regarding the, deflation that's happening in Europe, and bringing that back? I mean, you're talking about, exceptionalism where you see all this conflict in the rift. Is there any overlay, if you do it, another map of any economic conflict that's happening in the region? Could that also play into the different power dynamics with all that?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I think the short answer to the question is it is a factor that's in the mix. I haven't thought about it systematically to sort of be able to answer whether, if you were to map it out, what that map would look like. But what I would say is, and I've said this before in the U.S.-China context, let me put it to you the way I've sometimes said it. If you're the United States and you're growing at an annualized rate of 3+% per year, and if your unemployment is, say, 4.6 or 4.7%, which represents the lowest in the modern era that we've seen in the United States, then from a position of economic strength, China looks one way. If you're growing at, well, if you're in recession, if you're not growing, on the other hand, and if your unemployment is over 10%, China looks very different. It looks a lot more menacing when your own economic circumstances are very difficult, as was the case in the United States in 2008, 2009, 2010, and even into 11 and 12. But certainly in those very tough years at the worst of the recession, I argue that it wasn't so much that, let's say, China had changed, although it maybe was doing some things differently, but it was as much or more the case that our own economic position had changed, and that colored our perception of threat. It made us feel more vulnerable. It made us feel that the threats that were out there loomed larger. It made us more concerned about things like the notion of people taking jobs away from us and so forth and so on. More sensitive to issues like intellectual property theft and so on. So that's one example in one bilateral relationship, but I think you could apply that basic construct more generally, going to your question. And so that's why I think there is a connection between the issue of how the world economy is performing and how individual economies are performing on the one hand, and perceptions of threat and perceptions of national well-being on the other. Those things, I think, do interface with each other in ways that are very dynamic.
Okay, great. And I guess with that, we can wrap up that little section. Thank you, David, so much for coming on the show today. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you.
No, great. Thank you.